Good afternoon, and welcome to another Epic Live discussion. With us this afternoon, we have Dr. Shmuel Bar, a Middle East expert, and Ms. Marta Murzańska, an ERPIC Senior Fellow. Our focus this afternoon will be on regional security and specifically on Islamism and the challenge that it presents to the region and to the West. Shmuel, thank you for being with us. It's interesting because there's so much religious intolerance in this part of the world, and yet traditionally people from different religions were living next to each other and part of the same societies in most of the countries of the Middle East. Isn't this strange? What's your initial comment to that?
Well, first of all, we have to be precise historically. There was definitely no ideal world of everybody like Woody Allen said, the lamb will lie down with the lion, but the lamb won't get much sleep. There were pogroms in the Arab world against Jews and Christians. There were forced conversions in Iran, in Iraq, in Morocco. The difference was that as long as the non-Muslims accepted the status of dhimmi, of second-class citizens, and there was, if we're talking about the 19th century up to the end of the Caliphate, there was a relationship between the Caliphate and the West, which actually provided Western countries with a sort of patronage over the Jewish and Christian populations, up to the point where France and Britain actually gave their citizenship individually to Jews and Christians in Jerusalem and made them their citizens and then got patronage over them. And of course then the Sultan couldn't touch them. So basically we had it was the millet system, or the dhimmi system, which
and the
existed.
Russians did that.
The Russians,
Emperor,
exactly. So everybody was intervening. Right. And now, the thing is that it isn't anything that you say, well, the general outlook in the region was always tolerant or something like that. There's quite a lot of intolerance inside the basic fabric of many of these cultures. In Shiite Islam, for example, you can't touch a Jew or a Christian. You become impure, and you have to wash yourself. You can't eat from a plate that a Jew or Christian has touched, or things like that. There are various things like that. However, the balance existed, and so here or there pogroms of one sort or another. The situation changed at a certain point at the beginning of the 20th century. What we're actually now seeing, though, is finally the end of World War I. In other words, World War I ended. There was the Sykes-Picot Agreement. There were secular governments which imposed some sort of discipline on the natural. It's very similar to Yugoslavia, where Tito kept the lid over everything, and then when Yugoslavia fell apart, everything fell apart. And now we are actually at the end of that period, which held all of these pressures in place.
Yeah.
Now, the topic of our conversation today is the Islamist challenge to the Eastern Mediterranean and Europe. And I believe that before we get into the heart of our discussion, we should maybe try to explain to our audience what Islamism is. How can it be defined? I mean, very often such terms as political Islam, Islamic fundamentalism, radical Islam, Jihadism, political Islam are used interchangeably. Is this correct?
What's in a name? First and foremost, I would be very, very careful about the political correctness of saying that this has nothing to do with Islam. We have to have some respect for our enemies. if someone says that I'm doing this because of Islam, because I believe that this is what Allah and the Prophet wants for me, then first of all believe him. You know your enemy and you win half of the battles. Secondly, Islam is by definition political.
Right. So there is no distinction between Islam and Islamists.
Between Islam and state. Islam is, they say it's din wa dawla, which means state, religion and state. Because the original Islamic state was the state of the Prophet. The Prophet was both the Prophet, who gave the religious laws, and the military commander and the political commander. The Caliph, what is the Caliph? The Caliph is the replacement of the Prophet of Allah. And so he is supposed to be the supreme religious and political and military commander. So the ideal of the Islamic state cannot be a state in which there is a separation of church and state. Now, extending from that, then the whole question is how political is a person's worldview in context to what you have to do. In other words, not what it would be nice if Allah would do for you. Allah would bring, Deus ex machina, a caliphate, and everything would be nice, but what do you have to do? Mm-hmm. And this is a development of the 20th century, beginning with various ideologues of the Islamic movement and the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, and an idea which does basically individualization of the duty of jihad. So we have to make this differentiation between various streams. A stream which is a Salafi stream, which just says we have to be very pious and imitate the forefathers. Mm-hmm. It may seem to us as to be very atavistic, but as long as they are not political. So they can be extremely fundamentalist and not political. They can be very fundamentalist, and they can believe that they have to take things into their hands and create an Islamic state. And there can be those who say, even before we create an Islamic state, we want to attack the infidels and we have to defend ourselves against the infidels. And that's another story. So you have all of these different types.
But would it be valid to say that Islamism is not on the fringe of the Muslim world as it is often to believe?
Yeah, definitely not. It is not the fringe, and you can see that in all of the Pew polls, for example. I think that if we say that somewhere around 60% of the population of Pakistan thinks that ISIS has a positive view of ISIS, I mean, that's not marginal. 25% of the Muslims of France say that they would either be favorable or indifferent to a member of their family joining ISIS. That's not marginal at all. If you compare it to the level of just other people in the Western world or in other countries or in the East, in China or in Japan, who if you ask a Japanese, if a member of your family joined Aum Shinrikyo, which is a terrorist organization, would you be proud? You wouldn't have 1% of the Japanese agree to that, right? So that's the big difference.
So therefore, terms such as radicalism or extremism, aren't they misleading?
Radicalism, I really don't know what that is, because radical is in reference to something. Extreme is certainly in reference to something. So let's assume that on the norm, 98% of the people in the world want to get up in the morning, to have breakfast, to feed their children, to go to work, and to veg out in front of the TV in the evening if they have a TV. Now, so very few of them think about how many infidels can I kill today, and etc. However, the problem is not that. The problem is, what is the attitude of the majority towards those people who are violent? Do they accept them into the fabric of their consensus or not? So there is in Islam, and this is the main problem, in Islam there is no firewall on the spectrum between what we call mainstream and radical.
Right, so the line is very blurry.
Exactly. Now, if we take an example, if I am radical Muslim and you are a mainstream Muslim and you have a nice job at an institute and, and I say to you, is it true that jihad is one of the prime duties of Islam? You can't tell me no. Is it true that military jihad is definitely jihad? Well, yes, in 98% of the mentions of jihad in the Quran and the Hadith, it's military jihad. It doesn't mean anything else. Then I can say, is it true that the Prophet Muhammad waged jihad most of his life? Yes. Could the Prophet Muhammad do anything wrong? No, he was infallible. Meanwhile, we are still in the area of pure religious discourse. Is it true that when a Muslim land is occupied by infidels, it becomes the individual duty of every Muslim to wage jihad, individual jihad, and that a woman need not ask her husband, and a child need not ask his father, and a slave may not ask his master, and they all should participate in jihad? Yes, there's a very good hadith which says that. So why aren't you coming with me to Iraq to aid the Muslims in Iraq or in Syria to fight a jihad? You say, I've got a good job, and I've got job security, etc. So you prefer being a friend of the infidels instead. In other words, at no point can you say, wait a minute, I'm checking my book of Islam. That's not there.
So you're saying that being radical Muslim or not is a matter of attitude of the person, not the ideology. In other words, you cannot classify the ideology itself as radical or non-radical. Islam is Islam, the Quran is the Quran, and it depends how
the person, the individual, implements it.
Implements it. So you're either a practicing Muslim or not.
No,
or is that going too far?
No, you can be a practicing Muslim, you can be even a Salafi Muslim, and you can, wear strange clothes in our eyes, and you can do things, and you can be very, very careful about everything you do, and you can be totally apolitical. In other words, you can say, this is what I do.
But can you be? I mean, the Quran is a political instrument. So can you be an apolitical Muslim? In the same token, can you be a moderate Muslim? What is moderation?
Okay, moderation means fudging it.
Well, not practicing.
Yeah,
I hate to put that.
No, you can practice here we have to make the distinction. You can go through the motions of doing everything. You can pray 5 times a day, and you can do everything. You can fast, and you can do all of that. The question is whether, in the course of your interpretation of Islam, you decide that you have to intervene on your own in political, military, etc. issues because this is what Allah wants of you. In other words, if you leave it at Allah wants me to pray 5 times a day, etc.
Isn't that selective?
It's selective. It's definitely selective. But you see, most people were not confronted with that dialogue that I was holding with you, are willing to be selective. So until the moment where I proved to her that she should come with me on the jihad, she was happy to be selective. But when I come to her and she's in cognitive dissonance.
Sure, but that's the element of radicalization, where radicalization comes in. By dialogue, you show that you're not being a good Muslim.
Exactly.
And therefore you should, but it's not radicalizing the person, it's making them a better Muslim.
It's externalizing elements in the religious outlook which are inherent, which are innate in Islam, and which can remain dormant or can not remain dormant. And
isn't that a bias of secular thinking? We're almost imposing these categories because in our mind, if you're basically secular and tolerant and blah, blah, you become radicalized by becoming less so.
Well, I don't like
whereas I think I'm just probing.
No, I don't like the idea of the whole concept of radicalization, or especially self-radicalization. And here we have to understand. I once had I was giving a briefing in the United States to a very senior group, and people who deal in homeland security, And when I explained to somebody that the Quran says you shall not take Jews and Christians as friends, and you shall support your brother, be oppressor or oppressed, and I'm quoting the Quran, and then this very senior person says to me, "That's interesting, is that in the moderate Quran as well?" And I say, no, when you go into Barnes and Nobles, there's not
no
moderate Quran. In other words, it's a matter of what you take out of it.
Yeah. So just to sort of understand, in the Quranic tradition and the Muslim tradition, there is no attempt or process of changing or reforming the message. The message is the message, and you either accept it or you're an apostate. Or is it putting it too harshly?
Well, I think first of all, formally in Islam, the right to do self-interpretation of the Quran was abolished. It's called closing the gates of ijtihad. It was finalized somewhere around the 10th, 11th century. In other words, after that, you're not allowed to do it in Sunni Islam. In Shiite Islam, you're allowed, which is interesting because Shiite Islam has more latitude actually than Sunni Islam. And for most of the history, it worked for the best.
There have been under Shia new interpretations or reinterpretations.
Oh yes, ayatollahs, especially great ayatollahs, really do reinterpretation. Actually, to the extent that Khomeinism is reinterpretation of Shiite Islam. It is a revolution. Khomeini's doctrine was not traditional Shiite doctrine, but because of that element in Shiite Islam which allows interpretation.
Where does that come from? I mean, because there's an sort of an infusion of rationalism, almost.
It has to do with the fact that...
is it because the Iranians had a traditional sort of culture that included other elements, perhaps, or is it not an Iranian thing?
No, it's not an Iranian thing. It's in Shiite Islam. It has to do with the status of the clergy in Shiite Islam. It has to do with a hierarchy which existed in Shiite Islam, which doesn't exist. You have a mullah, you have a khund, you have a mullah, you have a Hujjat al-Islam, you have a Ayatollah Uzma, and it is a clerical hierarchy. And
but not in Sunnism.
You don't have that in Sunni Islam. But
where's that coming from? I mean, in Shia, where does that hierarchy come from again?
There are a lot of, quite a lot of historic reasons for that. Part of it has to do with the structural.
It's almost though a different sort of cultural.
It's a completely different. To a great extent.
Influence.
To a great extent. I mean, just think about it. Why does Protestantism not have that sort of a structure, and Catholicism does?
Well, because very simply, it was a reaction against Catholicism. It was a negation of the hierarchy, etc., etc.
So
I think Shia was not necessarily a negation of Sunnism.
Well, Shia Islam was definitely, it was part of the. Everybody will say, each one will say they rebelled against the other, but Shiite Islam, it was born out of a war between...
but it was a claim to orthodoxy. I think there was a competing claim.
It was a claim for power. In other words, who was going to be the caliph?
Who was going to be the caliph, Who was right, who
but you
was
see, as long
closer
as there
to
was a caliph,
Muhammad.
as long as there was a caliph, and the caliph is the supreme religious authority, you don't need a religious hierarchy.
Sure.
But if you don't have a caliph and the imam is in hiding, you can't become a caliph and say take over the job of the imam, because the imam is there, he's hiding.
This business about the secret imam, what is that in Shiaism?
That's an old story. I mean, basically, the idea is that he is in hiding and that he will emerge. And
why is he in hiding?
He disappeared. And he will emerge when his believers need him the most. And traditionally there was a debate whether he will emerge when his believers are in really deep trouble and then he will emerge, or will he emerge when his believers take action and prove that they are worthy of his emerging.
Sort of a messianic.
Exactly, but it's like the concept of forcing him to come. So the doctrine in Iran, in the Khomeini's doctrine in Iran, is more along the lines of, we will prove that we are worthy of the hidden Imam, he will come. But I think, you see, since radical Shiite Islam is mainly Iranian, it serves, it's state terrorism, it's, you know, it's very clear, Hezbollah is just an organ of the Iranian state, it's the Lebanese brigades of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard. Sunni, whatever we want to call it, radical Islam, is an ideological movement. It's an ideological movement in which there is no firewall between it and mainstream Islam. So at any given point, since most of the Islamic movements, the radical Islamic movements, have some element of what's called takfir, declaring another Muslim a non-Muslim. Now, in Islamic doctrine, there's a saying, do not say to he who says Salamu alaikum, you are not a Muslim, because only God can know what the real intention of a person is. Now, what that means is that mainstream Muslims will not declare a radical, no matter how vicious and terrible he may be, an apostate. But the radicals will. So the weapon of apostasy, of declaring apostasy, is not in the hands of the moderates. Now, except for Imam John Kerry, who just recently declared, John Kerry declared that ISIS are apostates. And the whole Muslim world went up, who are you, Imam John Kerry, to say that ISIS is apostates? So if there is no firewall of takfir, I'll give you an example. After 9/11, the Iranians of all people said that these people who did 9/11 are burning in hell. So it's easy for them to say because these are Sunnis. The Saudis convened a conference of about 100 and something imams and sheikhs from all over the Muslim world to discuss the question whether these people are burning in hell. They reached a conclusion, it was in 2000. They were not. Why? Because only Allah knows the intentions. A person is not expected to know the difference between good and evil. He is expected only with good intentions to follow what he believes Allah wants of him. If they believe that Allah wants them to do this, and they believed it with good intention, then Allah will reward them for their intentions, because he doesn't expect, you can't punish a person for something that he wasn't able to do.
Could you elaborate on that? Because I remember hearing you say what the difference between the Judeo-Christian tradition was and the Muslim tradition of as far as this the individual's duty to judge one's capacity to judge one's actions.
It has to do with a number of things. One of them is the very concept of knowledge of good and evil, which in the Quran, Adam didn't eat from the fruit of knowledge of good and evil, so he never got it. And therefore, a person, this is basically in Islam means submission. In other words, you submit to the will of God. If you don't have the knowledge of good and evil, then how can I expect you to choose good or evil? You must then submit, and you must do what you are told is the will of Allah. Now, what that means is that this absolves a person of personal accountability. You just have to obey. If you don't have personal accountability, then the very concept that is inherent in the Judeo-Christian tradition, which gave us the Nuremberg trials, for example, this very concept cannot be implemented in Islam, because what do you expect of them? They were obeying.
Right.
Now,
as long as they have good intentions. It's the
right. And then the next thing is
Nuremberg community.
Now, the next problem is that as a result, the very concept of democracy is that if we put a lot of people together who normally will choose good because they all have something in them which they ate from the fruit of knowledge of good and evil, then it's as if we say statistically they will together choose good, and that's what democracy is based on some underlying assumption. But if we do not think that people have this capacity, then why have democracy?
But again, it's a debate whether it's a Hobbesian world or
Or
a
a
Lockean.
Lockean world. I think we live in a Hobbesian world, but for example, one of the interesting things that one of the few Western philosophers who is studied in the House of Qom is Heidegger. Why Heidegger? Because Heidegger actually expounded the idea that the people cannot know good, and therefore they need a Führer to tell them what to do. And this
but in some ways, Nazism has certain elements which are reminiscent of what we were just talking about, because
Well,
it's this relying, as long as you have good intentions, that you're serving the motherland and you listen to what your Führer says,
there is in
you're
Islamic
off the hook.
there
Or
is
at least, you don't have to have sleepless nights.
there is in the Muslim Brotherhood, for example, the structure of the Muslim Brotherhood youth group movements and Hezbollah. We caught in South Lebanon instructions to the youth movement of the Kashaf of Hezbollah, and they looked very strange to me. There was a question: if your father expresses doubts about the authority of the supreme leader, what do you do? A, respect him because he's your father, discuss it with him. C, report on him to your superior in the movement. The right answer is C. Anyway, I sent this to a friend of mine who's an expert on Nazi Germany. I said, what do you think about this? He sent me back a questionnaire from the Hitlerjugend in German, which was almost the same. In other words, authoritarian, totalitarian movements, I don't know whether they borrow from each other or they very naturally converge on the same ideas, but you can actually see that. Definitely Hassan al-Banna was highly influenced by the fascist movements of the 1930s as he developed his organization. And as we see, the affection towards Heidegger. But I think, though, that what we're talking about something is even broader than that. We're talking about an ideological movement. The penchant of the West to look for an organization. We kill bin Laden, we attack, military attack on ISIS. In other words, we have to look at a movement and we have to say there's a PowerPoint presentation with boxes, and and this leads to this. There's a chart. There's an organogram, and it doesn't work like that. We're talking about a real ideological movement that, for reasons of political correctness, we refuse to acknowledge.
Is that the challenge of Islamism, both in the region and in a broader European sense? I mean, that it's a challenge to our concepts and our way of thinking strategically and so on?
Well, I think it just, the moment you do not recognize your enemy as what it is, you are tying your hands. When you're talking about wars, it may probably not come as a surprise to anybody that there was not one tank at Midway, and there was not one ship at Kursk. In other words, a land battle is fought with land weapons and air and sea battle. A religious battle is a religious battle only actually once one side sees it as a religious battle. What we are trying to do is to say
secularize it,
and so we say, it's a matter of economy, or for example, there was a statement by the American Secretary of State that actually one of the key causes of the growth of ISIS is unemployment. In other words, there aren't enough McDonald's restaurants in Iraq and Syria, so people don't have jobs chopping hamburgers, so they start chopping heads. But if you look at it that way, then you're not going to get anywhere.
But yet there is still a secular element in certainly the struggle in Syria. I mean, the involvement of some of the neighboring countries, particularly Turkey, and so on. It has a secular geopolitical agenda. or does
Yes,
it not?
religion doesn't exclude geopolitical interests. I mean, the
No,
fact.
but surely, but I'm saying that there is that element. So perhaps the West focuses on that element and reserves
Yes, but you
the
cannot.
ideological. Can you separate?
But
them?
you have to have. It has to be holistic. The flow of foreign fighters to the Islamic State isn't geopolitical. It is religious. It's ideological.
Yeah, and especially, I mean, even the certain elements of the Turkish government suggest that this is perhaps it's time to look at a different paradigm of the region, a different paradigm. I think the Turkish premier even wrote a book about alternative paradigms.
Yes, I don't like his paradigms.
But doesn't that dovetail a little bit with this view? I mean, the more Orientalist, religious aspect, which for us is anachronistic.
Yeah.
I mean, and there's that element. I mean, I think you had made another point about the anachronism that doesn't exist or works the opposite way in Islam.
I think the situation, first of all, the paradigm of the Middle East has broken. I mean, let's be honest that, Sykes-Picot is done. It's not going to revive. We can't resuscitate. We have to accept that what we now see is what I call the Humpty Dumpty states. And just like Humpty Dumpty, all the king's horses, all the king's men can't put Humpty together again. So Syria will not be a state again. And even if the Russians put in as much air power as they want, in the end, to hold those places that the Syrian army has to hold, you need ground forces.
Yeah.
And 250,000 people.
Well, the Balkanization of Syria will happen. It's happened already.
It's done.
So it's a question of where those lines are going to be drawn. And again, are those lines arbitrary, or are they? There is an element of arbitration in there. I mean,
the lines are tribal.
Yeah, but still, I think they're deciding whether to, let's say, the Russians are thinking about this Syrian Kurdish area. That's not entirely tribal. I mean,
unless you say they're Kurdish tribal. But the Russians are bringing their worldview into this, and definitely it's a strategic concept. The Russians want to have leverage over NATO. And basically what they're saying now is you will not fly NATO aircraft even inside
deny zone that the U.S. had in Iraq.
Exactly.
It's the Russian version of
exactly.
Of the
so the no-fly
zone.
zone. So the no-fly zone that America said that it could not impose in northern Syria, which had it imposed, the whole situation would have been different, because then you wouldn't have the refugee problem. But the Americans didn't impose it, and now the Russians are imposing a no-fly zone, but actually no flying zone against NATO. And what they're saying is that even if NATO aircraft fly inside NATO territory in Turkey in an offensive deployment, they will shoot it down. They have the ability to shoot them down. So that's strategic. But it dovetails with the Kurdish aspirations, of course, where the Kurds would have preferred to be on the side of the West because they feel more of an affinity with the West.
Yeah.
And actually Russia has hijacked the Kurds, and just recently Syrian Kurdistan opened their first diplomatic office in Moscow, of all places. And basically what that means is that they can deny Turkey access to Syria, and they can leverage this against Turkey through the PKK, etc., and then they can trade their assistance on that with concessions in the Balkans, in the Baltic states, etc. So that's strategic.
I mean, are the Russians intending to sort of curtail, to a certain degree, Turkish influence in the Eastern Med? Do you see that as a specific policy, and it's a reaction to what? To Turkish, some sort of to this Turkish paradigm.
Ottomanism.
Neo-Ottomanism. Is there such a thing? I mean, in your view?
I think that definitely Erdogan is espousing a neo-Ottomanism. One of his supporters, the Yusuf Qaradawi, for example, said that Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi is not worthy of being a caliph. If there is anybody today worthy of being a caliph, it's Erdogan. So, so definitely
would prefer Erdogan over
of ISIS. But the Russians have strategic interest in the Mediterranean. The gas is a strategic interest of Russia. They do not want a level of stability of and development of gas alternatives in the Eastern Mediterranean that would make Western Europe less dependent
or
on
at least
Russia.
that they don't have a finger in.
Yeah, that they can keep their finger on. So therefore, they are the ones, basically they're saying they don't even need all of Syria. The Russians are talking about what they call useful Syria.
Right.
Useful Syria is Alawistan. It's Alawistan,
sure.
but they have to make sure that Alawistan is can stand, and therefore it has to be mainly Alawite, which means that you have to do ethnic cleansing of the non-Alawites, which is what they're doing. Now, there is a convergence of interests of Turkey on one hand and Syria, where the Syrians want to get rid of the Sunnis in the area of Alawistan.
Turkey and Syria, or Russia and Syria?
No, Russia and Syria, obviously, but Turkey, because from the point of view of the Turks, once the Syrians are kicking out Sunnis in that area, now what you actually have is a very interesting collusion here. We have to understand that the flow of people to Izmir, through Turkey to Izmir, Turkey has a very powerful army. If Turkey wanted to keep people in camps on the border and not allow them to get to the coast, they could do it. I don't think that anybody thinks that Izmir isn't under the control of the Turkish Navy. Now, what you see also is that the refugees get through Hezbollah lines to Tripoli and immediately get on boats to Izmir. They don't get from Tripoli directly.
It's not a land bridge.
A lot of them go to Tripoli and from there to Izmir, and immediately what you have is
by water, not
by
through
water,
not through road.
and then immediately what you get is these smugglers who are intimately linked to the Turkish army. And there are all sorts of pieces of information that the senior people in the Turkish army are getting kickbacks from the smugglers. So it's an actual big business now.
Yeah.
And this big business is linked to the Turkish army.
So how do you explain this European attitude of allowing Turkey to shirk its responsibility and in fact, more than that, paying Turkey?
I would then be going not into analysis, but into some sort of socio-psychological analysis, which isn't my field. The question is
guilt of Mrs. Merkel.
No, I think
collective guilt.
I think there's something I think there's something in the European attitude today which characterizes the European attitude of, first of all, deference towards non-European countries, the feeling post-colonial guilt syndrome.
But with Turkey, it goes beyond that. It's actually coddling Turkey. It's a conscious desire to please Turkey. That it's beyond this sort of complex.
Yes, it is, but it's because Europe is conducive to blackmail. What happened after the Paris attacks was blackmail. It was pure blackmail, because it isn't a business agreement. We give you 3 billion, and here is what you do, and this is a fundamental breach of contract, and it's not a business agreement. It's we give you 3 billion, and you will try to stem the tide, the flow of immigrants. Best efforts. But then they'll say, and they already say, they're not delivering the goods. And they won't deliver it because, let's not forget, Turkey wanted access to the European Union. The European Union did not want Turkey, and after all of the discussions of human rights and structure, etc., the European Union does not want a predominantly Muslim country, 70 million people in the European Union. And Turkey knows that. And then basically what Turkey is saying to Europe, you didn't want us in the European Union.
See what
We
happens.
are going to bring down Schengen.
Your
pride and joy.
Yeah.
And basically this is what they're doing. And you will pay us to mitigate these effects. So there is nothing in the agreement for the 3 billion that Turkey will stop importing oil from ISIS. Why? Because Turkey says we're not importing oil from ISIS. There's nothing in the agreement which says that Turkey will stop allowing foreign fighters to cross the border, because Turkey says we're not doing it. So basically, it isn't an agreement, it is charity that Europe is giving money to Turkey without any commitment on the part of Turkey. And so if the European Union doesn't demand something from Turkey and it's willing to give the money without it, then why shouldn't Turkey take it?
I was speaking about Turkey. Turkey's covered support for various jihadist groups in Syria, including ISIS, has recently become apparent. I mean, it was an open secret for a long time, but now it's pretty obvious that this is what they're doing. What is Turkey's regional game with regard to the support of various strains of jihadists?
Yeah, Turkey sees itself in. First of all, there's the neo-Ottoman concept, and Turkey definitely sees itself as a regional hegemon. Secondly, Turkey was committed to toppling the Syrian regime. The affinity that Turkey feels, that the Turkish people...
Again, that was strange, because for so long they were, Assad
friends,
and Erdogan actually took holidays together.
Yes,
so what went wrong?
What went wrong was that if you are aiming at projecting yourself as an Islamic movement, an Islamic paradigm, and you want people to accept your Islamic paradigm, even though it's very difficult for Arabs to accept a non-Arab paradigm because of cultural differences, then to ally yourself with a regime which is killing, an Alawite regime which is killing Sunnis, when it was 10,000, 20,000, 30,000, when it's 250,000 Sunnis who have been massacred by this regime, if you are not against that regime, you will completely lose your legitimacy, not only in the Arab world, but you have created an Islamic movement in Turkey. And this Islamic movement is Sunni. And for you to turn your backs on Sunnis, in the end, it's tribalism. Today, we have to understand that the Middle East has fallen apart, and it's regrouping along tribal lines, and mainly the Sunni Shiite schism. And so your position, where you are being judged whether you are Sunni or Shiite, America today is perceived as pro-Shiite, as supporting Iranian Shiite hegemony. If you are in Saudi Arabia or in Cairo and you say, well, let's see, the Americans...
Because of Iraq, basically.
No, not only because of Iraq. Americans helped topple secular Sunni President Mubarak, supported the rise of the Muslim Brotherhood to power. The Americans were against...
But it wasn't, the Muslim Brotherhood was not Shia.
No. But the Muslim Brotherhood of Egypt was pro-Iranian, was actually expressed a very pro-Iranian position. Then the Americans tried to block Sisi, who is anti-Iranian and anti-Muslim Brotherhood. The Americans took a position on a red line regarding use of chemical weapons, backed back from that red line, and actually gave a lifeline to Assad, which he allowed him to massacre Sunnis. Americans supported. There was the elections in which the Shiite pro-Saudi candidate Alawi could have been elected. The Americans put pressure to choose Maliki, who was an Iranian proxy. And then they supported with weapons Maliki, who actually provoked an uprising in Anbar in order to get all of the Shiites behind him. So if you look at all of that, America looks actually very pro-Shiite. They reach an agreement with Iran, which is perceived by the Sunnis as enhancing Iran's capabilities. They see how America acts towards Iran, for example, allowing the Iranians to take American boats and to hold them captive and then say thank you for releasing them. So all of this looks like America is pro-Shiite.
But does it look like it, or is it?
Look, I'm not. I haven't put President Obama on the couch, but I think that definitely the current American administration believes that Iran is a great power. Iran is a civilization.
Needs to be brought back into the.
And must be brought back into
the game,
a hegemonic role in a region which all of the rest are, in the eyes of Obama, anachronistic creations of imperialism and colonialism.
Coming back though to what Marta asked, what is the game plan for Turkey? With all these, with the flip-flop in Syria and whatever.
So Turkey has, first of all, a strategic problem, a strategic dilemma. Turkey knows, Erdogan knows that demography will not lie, and in another 20 years, Turkey will be a majority Kurdish country because of the birth rate. The Kurdish threat is the main threat for Turkey. Everything Turkey is doing relates to the Kurdish threat. So Turkey has to block a Kurdish entity. It's more important than blocking ISIS or blocking Assad.
Is the majority of Kurds in Turkey, though, pro, Kurdish independence, or is there a mainstream of Kurds in Turkey who feel Turkish?
I'm sure that there are, but you see, all of this can change very quickly in the Middle East. The Syrian Kurds, up to the breakdown of Syria, were just begging for Syrian citizenship, which was denied to them because they were actually denied Syrian citizenship. Now things have changed, and I don't think any of them want to be the citizens of Alawite Syria. So these things change so rapidly in the region that if you have a strong Russian-protected
Syrian Kurdish
PKK organized Syrian Kurdistan, which even gets some, they have they'll have an embassy in Moscow, etc. Then you will have an irredentist movement inside Turkey. If the Turkish government continues to act as it does now
and
towards
deny
the
them
Kurds,
their rights, etc.,
exactly,
then they might even have a legal standing for self-determination.
But
or whatever,
even if they have, they certainly have a legal standing anyway. But it will exacerbate the sense of the Kurds in Turkey that they don't want to be part of Turkey. Iraqi Kurdistan was willing years ago to be part of a federation. Today, they're not. Because the federation is no longer relevant, because they don't have a contiguity with Shiite Iraq. What they have is with ISIS. So what do they need the federation for? So all of these things are in a state of flux.
Now, I would like to ask a question which might seem a little bit cliche, but I believe that many people actually do not know the answer to this question, precisely because what was mentioned before, there is no honest debate about Islamism in Europe, in the West in general, because of this paralyzing fear of being called Islamophobic. What do Islamists really want? What do they struggle for? What do they fight for?
In general, it is widely accepted in Islam that eventually Islam will have to be the religion of the entire world. I mean, this is a basic Islamic tenet. There is no concept of ecumenism in Islam, that you can have a number of religions. True, Christianity had a proselytizing period where the idea was to bring everybody under the fold of Christianity. At one point, even with the Catholic Church and certainly others, that's sort of gone back down into the dustbin of history, and that's it. Islam is still at the stage where it is the revealed truth. It has overridden the previous religions. There is only one truth, and this truth has to be spread until the word of Allah be in the world.
So could we say that what they struggle for is some sort of a new world order based on Sharia?
Eventually, the other side of it is that majority of Muslims in the world do think that Sharia should rule.
Should be.
Even in Europe, majority of Muslims say that Sharia, because you can't really be a believing Muslim and not think that Sharia is the way that you should live.
But especially what's happening is that a lot of European cities are now looking like a lot of Middle Eastern cities, with this, sequestration of the segregation of different communities.
Yes, but that is because Europeans do not have as much respect for their own values. In other words, it's a struggle between two parts.
What can you do? Walk into there and do a pogrom?
No.
I mean, it's a fait accompli already.
No, but
I mean, once you allow these things to set up, or once you tolerate them, these ghettos.
It may be too late, for example, in places like Sweden, for example.
What can you do about it?
I think that first of all, there are ways to put pressure on mainstream Islamic leaders who have assets or who have interests that they don't want to be harmed, and to impose on them certain behavior. You can say to people, listen, in your mosque, there are certain things here you will not preach and nobody will preach.
But don't they do that? I mean, there's organizations, Islamist organizations in Europe that profess or suggest or claim that they're fully in line with liberal democracy and all of that. But yet, undercover, they have a different agenda.
Yes, but even when you read, first of all, you have to read what they write.
So it's not on the level. I mean,
if you read what they write in Arabic as opposed to what they write in European languages, then first of all, it's very different. I think that you have to know the language, know what they're doing.
There's a bit of deception there, no?
There's definitely a lot of deception, because what they say inside in their own language, but outside of
isn't deception sometimes part of the jihad?
There is the Muslim Brotherhood, actually, taqiyya, which is dissimulation, is a basic feature in Shiite Islam, because the Shiite is allowed even to pretend he's not a Shiite in order to survive, and that's called taqiyya. Now, taqiyya actually...
Taqiyya is not a Sunni concept.
No, it is a Shiite concept, but it is also a Sunni concept for the Muslim Brotherhood, where Hassan al-Banna himself allowed taqiyya. So, but that's going into details about something where basically the idea is, if I am an imam of a big mosque, and there are activities in this mosque, I, as a government, or as a security service, or as a police, I should have the right to say, true, these people are only quoting verses from the Quran which say how you should kill all the Jews and etc., etc. But even if it's written in the Quran, you've got a lot of verses in the Quran that you can read day in, day out without reaching that verse, and you will not preach that verse. And you will not give a sermon about that verse, because if you do, we will close down your mosque, we will create problems for you, etc., etc.
But no Western government is willing to do it.
Okay, the question is whether you are willing to understand that you are in some sort of civilizational clash within Europe. I read a fascinating article, which I mentioned to you before, by Liam Ferguson, in which he compared the situation of Europe today to the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, where the Roman Empire actually invited the barbarians in and accepted them and degraded their own Romanism before the final fall of the Roman Empire. I think Europe has values, and the values free speech, freedom of thought, freedom of religion. When European leaders say that we think that Charlie Hebdo should refrain from insulting, why provoke people to do terrorist attacks by painting pictures of Muhammad? So we think they should stop it. So what they're saying is, in the conflict between our value, our religious value of freedom of expression, which should be as strong, as important, as cardinal for us as the value of the picture of Muhammad to them. And here there's a conflict. And what they're saying is, we must give up our value in the face of their value. Once you go down that very, very slippery road, there's a point where there are no brakes. And you just go down and down. And I think this is what happened in Europe. You even see the media, the European media, French, British, American also, after the Charlie Hebdo attack, they went to the Charlie Hebdo headquarters, offices, and they blurred out the pictures of. They showed the news. There was one of those editions where it had pictures of Muhammad, but they blurred it out so that the TV station won't be considered as having broadcast insulting pictures of Muhammad.
I think that many of them actually did that out of fear.
Okay, but the fact is that it's fear because governments cannot, governments, their job, before they were supposed to give Obamacare and things like that, governments, their first job was to give security. It's from the days when our forefathers, the cavemen, appointed the biggest caveman and said, you keep everybody else out of our cave and you're our chief. In other words, government has to provide security.
I think the concept of cultural, clash of cultures was not taken that seriously until now. It's there and it's looking European governments in the face. I mean, what, as a parting comment, is there any positive way of dealing with this? I mean, there seems to, what we're looking at is perhaps the rise of a reaction in the West under
which is also dangerous.
Which is perhaps very even more dangerous, because you'll have this backlash of nationalism and so on.
Definitely.
Is there something in between that can happen?
I think it's the weakness of government. Government has to face the situation, both the regional situation. In the region, the governments, Europe and the West, have to say, yes, the Middle East has fallen apart. You cannot cling on to the chimera of there is a Syria and go to Geneva and have discussions, or there is an Iraq and there is a Yemen, there is a Libya. You have to say, let's put them to rest and let's see how we preserve our interests in this region and make sure that there is as little as possible spillover. Within Europe, it's a different problem. There, you have to reconstruct the social contract. The moment you allow the idea of communities, you have to get back and say, there is no such thing as communities in Europe. This isn't a millet system. We are not creating the Ottoman Empire of Europe, where everybody belongs to a community. The whole idea of individualism in Western civilization is that you are a citizen of the state. In no Western system was there a hierarchy. Even if you were the lowest peasant in the Middle Ages, you were the peasant who gave his fealty to the baron, or whatever.
Group rights, for that matter. I mean, it's a debate between individual rights and group rights, which are mutually exclusive.
And we are the Western.
I think the U.S. The U.S. Supreme Court tried to to find a middle way, and it did with affirmative action. But affirmative action to protect certain minorities is temporary.
Yes.
Once you have group rights that are etched in stone,
Exactly.
then it's a problem.
But now in Europe, you actually are creating a millet system like in the Ottoman Empire. And this has to be stopped. In other words, it has to be clear. If you are a Christian, Muslim, Jew, Buddhist, Hindi, whatever, and you are living in European country A or B or in the United States, you are a citizen of that country. These are the values of that country. Free speech, freedom of religion, gender equality, freedom of sexuality, all of that. Now, if you do anything which infringes on any of those principles, those
You're
secular principles, then you are out. In other words, if you are not a citizen yet, you are out.
But what about those who are citizens?
Now, those who are citizens, I think that, Europe, because of the trauma of World War II, has laws against Nazism.
Yeah.
In other words, you can be prosecuted for being a Nazi. You can be prosecuted for idealizing Hitler because Hitler brought that much of suffering.
Yeah.
It's
But
better
it's narrowly defined as anti-Semitism. That nationalism or radical nationalism in Europe was anti-Semitism, and then so if you deal with anti-Semitism, other forms of ethnic,
But you see, anti-Semitism in Europe today by Muslims is not
is rampant, sure.
because if you
But even there, they've gone wrong. I mean, the European governments.
So the problem here is getting back to values and saying very firmly to those Muslim religious leaders and saying, look, you want to live among us. These are the rules. These are the rules. And that means that you're going to have to be very clear that in your mosques you won't be saying these things and you won't be declaring these things. And it's not a matter of saying, oh, we won't call for killing Christians, but it's okay that we can call for killing Jews or Hindis in Pakistan or something.
Yeah,
No.
yeah.
You are, in other words, and that should be the rule. After 9/11, a very high percentage of the Muslims in Holland were supportive of the attacks. The person who was in charge of coordinator of intelligence called in all of the imams of Holland, very typically Dutch, we'll all sit together and have some sandwiches and so he's opened up and he said to them, what's the problem with you? Why this animosity? Look what a nice country we are, and and how can you say that? So a person got up and he said, I am the Imam of Utrecht, and etc. And you see, Allah has said that the whole world will be Muslim, and this country will be Muslim too. Then he says to him, sir, what is your profession? What is your education? He said, I am a graduate of the Sharia school of this and this. And he said, no, I want to know what your education is in water engineering. He said, excuse me, water engineering? He said, well, you see, this country that you want to take away from us, it's already underwater. So if you want to take it, then you better get a good education in water engineering. Otherwise, why don't you go back to where... Now, this was in an inside discussion that he told me about. 2 weeks later, they discovered that there was a small mistake in his application for citizenship, a date or something like that, and they sent him back to Libya.
Where he's probably studying to be a water engineer.
But I'm saying, I mean, this may sound very crude, etc., and Europeans don't like that. But I think that there has to be a new social contract.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. It was a great discussion, I think. And hope to have you back soon.
With pleasure.
Thank you.